I'm Jonathan Davies from the Monfort University, and I've been working with quite a large number of colleagues over the past couple of years on a project looking at how cities govern austerity and through what political configurations. And we've been looking at Athens, Baltimore, Barcelona in alphabetical order, Dublin, Leicester, Melbourne, Montreal and Nantes. And I've been trying to have a think. I've flown back from Germany this morning, so I've been trying to have a think about how to create a relationship between the two themes of labour and markets on the one hand and the value of intelligence on the other, and thinking about how our research might address some of those issues. I apologise that what I'm about to say is quite impressionistic, but I hope it at least stimulates some thinking. What I'm going to talk about is to try and present a dialogue between two of the cities, Leicester and Barcelona, around the mediation of labour and markets by the politics of multiculturalism. And the comparative pivot there is the forms of political intelligence that construct relations between labour and markets. I should say that the case study lead in Barcelona is Dr. Ismael Blanco. So I'm not the investigator, Ismael is, and so I'm mining some of his data and some of his material here. Let me just briefly introduce Leicester then. It's a city of very stark distinctions. It's had a belly full of austerity over the past 8 years, as well as waves of crisis, deindustrialisation and neoliberalisation over decades before that. And its austerity governance strategy is something that I've coined the term Styrian realism to describe this. And this involves, on the one hand, saying, okay, we've got to make these cuts. Let's do this without fuss, without drama. Let's keep our heads down. We don't want to provoke any kind of conflict with national government. And on the other hand, it has involved fairly conventional attempts to recapitulate Leicester as an attractive city to investors. So, but what's interesting about this for current purposes is the way that in terms of its city branding strategy, it valorises Asian labour, Asian entrepreneurialism for resilience and enterprise. So the anchor to economic resilience in the city is perceived to be the entrepreneurship of Asians, waves of Asian migrants. And in the urban mythology of Leicester, the founding moment is the wave of migration from Uganda in the early 1970s under the persecution of Idi Amin. That valorisation of Asian entrepreneurialism exists in a very stark juxtaposition with what might be called the sweatshop capital of the UK. And this is something that I wasn't fully cognizant of, having worked in Leicester for several years, until I saw a piece of work published by colleagues at the University of Leicester, Nick Hammer et al. What they found was that there are more than 10,000 people in the area in the apparel industry earning half the minimum wage, about £3 an hour. This is just the apparel industry. I don't know what would happen if you conducted that inquiry in other parts of the economy, but still, £3 an hour, a rate which is achieved by employers under-declaring working hours. So they pay minimum wage, but for half the hours that people are actually working. Now, in governance terms, the way the City Council deals with this, and other leading actors in the city, in line with this disposition towards Styrian realism that I've been talking about, is very much not so much to conceal as to depoliticise it. So you get vocabulary, drama and conflict, and not in the interests of the city. Don't throw the investment baby out with the sweatshop bathwater. So what I was trying to get around to thinking about on my flight was that the city downplays one modality of black and minority ethnic labour, the sweatshop, in order to valorise another, BME entrepreneurship, so as to entice, or at least not to put off, market investors. So there's a form of economic rationalism underpinning the political intelligence of the city, whose locus is ultimately, I think, in faithfulness. This is the city we have to be. Now, that comes across very clearly when you hear the way that city leaders deal with critics of this model. So they can be called fantasists, and the city leaders will continually invoke reality against any form of critique. So as I say, the form of political intelligence that underpins this, I think, is a sense of fate. Now, I'm very interested in the work of the Guardian journalist Aditya Chakravarthi, and he argues that this approach is really the great error of Britain's loser cities. So it's not smart to use the vernacular. So he's done a lot of work with places like Preston and Burnley, and he argues that the moment of insight is to embrace loserness, to get off the attractiveness bandwagon and build coalitions of losers around community wealth building, which is something that the Labour Party nationally has now got into, inspired by the example of city councils like Preston. So that's the case of Leicester. How long have I got left?
17.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Now, Barcelona, by way of contrast, is very much seen as a winner city. There's a city with many losers in it, but the city government of Barcelona since 2015 has been trying to embrace this Chakravarti manifesto through shifting to what it sees as a radicalised model of co-production. Like Leicester, Barcelona has welcomed successive waves of migrants, particularly since the early 1990s. And people may recall there was a huge demonstration a year or so ago around the positive statement of solidarity with refugees and migrants. And the City Council believes that, and this is, I'm quoting here, human migration has contributed positively to the development of cities and major metropolitan areas worldwide. Now, of course, Barcelona has its own issues with sweatshop economies, trafficking, informal labour, and street vendors linked to the tourism economy. It's been governed by the radical anti-austerity coalition Barcelona en Comú since 2015, and they've taken a quite different approach, turning austerity against the market and applying the idea of austerity for the rich. So talking about a bloated private sector that really needs to be trimmed and rolled back a bit. And alongside that, they've been trying to cool the market, particularly in the spheres of the sort of tourism housing nexus. And that's also interwoven with the recognition of exploited migrant labour, and you see these issues playing out through things like its social procurement policy, which is about offsetting the importance of economic criteria in public tendering and protecting labour rights and building solidarity economies. Now, of course, the question of solidarity with street vendors is very complex given their interdependence with the tourism economy and the desire of the City Council to really damp down the tourism economy a little bit. So they are doing things like trying to retrain and set informal street vendors up in small business cooperatives rather than resort to kind of heavy-handed policing. Now, my point isn't so much about whether that works or what we make of this as a political strategy, but to kind of reinforce a key difference with Leicester, which is that the exploitation of BME labour is politicised. So Barcelona is trying to build practices of labour solidarity against the depredations of the market in a way that signifies a form of critical intelligence. Disclosure, problematisation, politicisation, where the locus of intelligence is in political agency. This is the city we can be. People may know that Barcelona hosted the inaugural Fearless Cities Conference in 2017 as the sort of global exemplar of this type of politics. So that's really the juxtaposition I want to draw. Is that type of comparison useful? That was another, or what gets lost in that type of comparison. I mean, we know that Leicester can't be Barcelona any more than Birmingham could be Florence, as those preaching the municipal gospel in the mid-19th century suggested that it might be able to become the Florence of the Midlands. But our respondents certainly find that kind of comparison useful. Everybody in our data set across the 8 case studies want to hear from Barcelona. So when we run the dissemination workshops in the different cities, we're always Skyping in Ismail from Barcelona to talk about what's happening in Barcelona, because people want a politics of hope beyond the fatalism of Styrian realism. I think I can leave it there.